In the year 36 AD, word reached Rome of unrest in the province of Judea in the east of the Roman Empire. The governor of the province, Pontius Pilate, persecuted and alienated many of the Jewish people of the region by clamping down on religious gatherings and requisitioning funds from the Temple of Jerusalem. Because of this misrule, the decision is quickly taken in Rome to replace Pilate. Who exactly was Pontius Pilate? And how did the man who is primarily famous for the trial of Jesus Christ preside and rule over Judea? This is the story of Pontius Pilate, Rome's most infamous governor. The man known to history as Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus in Latin, was born during the 1st century BC in the Roman Empire. He is best known as the Roman governor of Judea who presided over the trial of Jesus Christ and ordered his crucifixion. The main sources for Pilate's life and career as governor of Judea can be divided into Jewish and Christian sources. The Jewish sources include writings from the historians Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus, while the Christian sources consist primarily of the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. Pilate is also very briefly mentioned by the Roman historian Tacitus in his Annals from the early 2nd century AD. It is impossible to give a full account of Pilate's life, as nothing is known about him prior to his appointment as governor of Judea. Basic biographical details, such as his date and place of birth, his personal name, his parentage, his life before and after his governorship, the date and manner of his death, are all lost in the sands of time. However, as the official who was ultimately responsible for Jesus' execution, Pilate occupies an important place in history. The limited source material has led theologians and historians to interpret Pilate's character in very different ways. The most critical portray him as an anti-Jewish tyrant, while more positive interpretations cast him as someone who believed that Jesus was innocent and who only agreed to condemn him to satisfy the high priests of Jerusalem and the Jewish people there. Pilate was likely born in the last quarter of the 1st century BC, a time of significant political upheaval in the Roman Republic. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was appointed dictator for life by the Roman Senate after vanquishing his rival, Pompey the Great, but Caesar was assassinated shortly thereafter. His chief lieutenant, Mark Antony, and his great-nephew Octavian shared power for a decade until the outbreak of civil war between them in 32 BC. Octavian defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. In January 27 BC, he adopted the name Augustus and assumed the position of princeps, first citizen of Rome. While Augustus was careful to preserve the traditional republican offices, these events effectively marked the founding of the Roman Empire. The empire's territories included Italy, France, Iberia, Greece, Western Turkey, Egypt, and the North African coast, as well as Syria. Further to the south along the Levantine coast, Rome also exercised indirect control over the Kingdom of Judea via its client king, Herod the Great. Judea had been an independent kingdom ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty until 63 BC, when Pompey intervened in a succession dispute and forced the Hasmoneans to become client kings of Rome. In 37 BC, Herod led a rebellion against the Hasmonean king Antigonus II and captured Jerusalem with Roman support 3 years later. Although Herod backed Antony against Octavian during the civil war, the latter confirmed his rule in Judea. Herod remained on the throne for another 3 decades, during which time he completed an ambitious rebuilding program at the Second Temple of Jerusalem. After Herod died in 4 BC, Augustus confirmed the arrangements in the late king's will to divide his kingdom amongst his sons Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. Under this arrangement, Antipas and Philip each received a quarter of their father's kingdom respectively, while Archelaus was given the southern half, including Judea proper. However, a decade later, in 6 AD, Augustus deposed Archelaus and incorporated his territory directly into the Roman Empire as the province of Judea. According to Josephus, Archelaus had been removed from power due to his tyrannical attitude towards his Jewish subjects, though the Greco-Roman historian Cassius Dio attributes his fall to dynastic infighting among the Herodians. Antipas and Philip retained their realms and remained independent rulers. Under Roman rule, Judea was designated as a third-class imperial province with a small garrison of auxiliary troops commanded by the provincial governor. Should the governor require reinforcements to deal with larger-scale rebellions, he could call on reinforcements from the neighboring province of Syria, which had between 3 and 4 legions at its disposal. While the Roman governor and his garrison was based in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, established by Herod the Great in the late 1st century BC, Jerusalem remained the center of Jewish social, economic, religious, and political life. The Roman governor and his officials usually respected Jewish religious sensibilities and allowed the high priest of Jerusalem effective autonomy over the city government. The governor's prerogative to appoint and dismiss high priests at will ensured that they would pursue pro-Roman policies, and the governor and his troops would go to Jerusalem during major religious festivals to maintain order. Pontius Pilate was the 5th Roman governor of Judea and served between 26 and 37 AD. While nothing is known about his family background, the name Pontius associates him with the region of Samnium in central Italy. He may have been related to Gavius Pontius and Pontius Telesinus, who led Samnite armies against Rome in the 3rd and 1st centuries BC respectively. Another ancestor may have been Pontius Aquila, a politician who was among Julius Caesar's assassins. Like most other governors of Judea, Pilate was a member of the equestrian class, the second highest degree of nobility in Rome below the senatorial class. A typical Roman equestrian would have been wealthy. Early in his reign, Augustus doubled the wealth threshold to 400,000 sesterces, or 100,000 denarii, required to qualify for equestrian rank. While the rank was passed down from father to son, individuals could be stripped of the status during regular 5-year inspections if they no longer met the wealth threshold. Although the equestrian class owed its name to their service in the Roman cavalry, by the 2nd century BC, most equestrians served as senior officers in infantry units. They could hold both military and administrative offices, though the typical equestrian would have progressed through a series of military posts, including as prefects of legionary cohorts, military tribunes of legions, and prefects of auxiliary cavalry units. The prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard that became notorious for its role in palace coups, would also have been an equestrian. During the reign of Augustus, equestrians who had progressed through the military offices were eligible for certain administrative appointments. These were often less prestigious posts compared to those reserved for the senatorial class, with the exception of the wealthy province of Egypt. Such appointments were in the gift of the emperor, and the office holders were likely to have senatorial patrons to promote their cause. By the time Pilate was appointed governor of Judea, he would have had over a decade of military service behind him, perhaps in Germany or the Danube frontier. His name Pilate may be related to pilum, a kind of javelin, suggesting that he was a talented soldier. Pilate's tenure as governor of Judea is usually dated from 26 to 37 AD. This means he was appointed in the middle of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, who succeeded his stepfather Augustus as princeps in 14 AD. Tiberius is one of the most controversial figures in the history of the Roman Empire. According to traditional accounts of Tiberius by later Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, he had been a competent general and politician during Augustus's reign, but became a depraved tyrant after becoming emperor. More recent scholarship has cast Tiberius in a more positive light as a virtuous statesman who remained faithful to traditional republican values and struggled with wielding the absolute power he had inherited from Augustus. According to Tacitus, Tiberius appointed mediocre officials who lacked ambition but could be relied on not to bring Roman rule into disrepute. Most provincial governors enjoyed long tenures under Tiberius, and Pilate's 10-year stint in Judea was no exception. A fragmentary inscription from Caesarea indicates that Pilate's official title was prefect of Judea, emphasizing the military aspect of the office. As in most imperial provinces, Pilate would have had a small staff of advisors, scribes, and messengers to help him with his responsibilities to maintain law and order and collect taxes. Since Jews were exempt from military service, the auxiliaries that Pilate commanded as prefect amounted to around 5,000 non-Jewish troops from the cities of Caesarea and Sebaste, who had previously served the Herodian kings. Most of the provincial garrison was stationed at Caesarea, but the large Jewish population of Jerusalem required the presence of a Roman cohort to keep order. While Pilate could call on reinforcements from Syria during times of crisis, the Syrian legate of that province, Lucius Aelius Lamia, who served until 32 AD, carried out his duties from Rome. The difficulties in communicating with Lamia meant that Pilate could not rely on immediate assistance from the Syrian legions and had to act quickly to quell any unrest before it developed into a major rebellion. Pilate's military power was complemented by his supreme judicial power, which gave him the authority to execute imperial subjects. The high priest and the Jewish courts also had the authority to pass capital sentences on those who had violated Jewish law. Pilate's other main responsibility was to collect taxes which were sent to Rome. While the Roman authorities conducted censuses to determine each person's tax obligations, the limited administrative apparatus in Caesarea meant that Pilate relied on existing local systems. In Judea, tax collectors were typically wealthy members of the Jewish community who bid for the right to collect a specific tax at annual auctions supervised by the governor. Some Roman provincial governors used this process as an opportunity to enrich themselves by keeping part of the sum they received, and some of the sources accuse Pilate of financial impropriety. As with tax collection, day-to-day administration of the province was largely the responsibility of the Jewish high priest and religious elders in Jerusalem. In Judea and across the empire, the Romans co-opted local elites by preserving their privileges and relied on them to help legitimize Roman authority. This was more challenging for the Romans in Judea, where King Herod the Great had executed much of the incumbent elite after seizing power. After Judea became a Roman province in 6 AD, the Romans were forced to work with Herodian appointees who lacked popular legitimacy. While Herod had undermined the high priesthood, the Romans appointed an individual named Ananus ben Seti, whose family almost exclusively occupied the office between 6 and 41 AD. Throughout his governorship, Pilate allowed Ananus' nephew, Joseph Caiaphas, to remain as high priest. Pilate was appointed governor of Judea in 26 AD, the same year that Tiberius left Rome and retired to the island of Capri. Although Tiberius continued to exercise his power as emperor, the government in Rome was left in the hands of the praetorian prefect Lucius Aelius Sejanus. In Tiberius's absence, Sejanus presided over a reign of terror by purging influential senators and members of the imperial family in order to consolidate his own position. The German historian Ethelbert Stauffer, writing after the Second World War, argued that Pilate owed his appointment to Sejanus, who instructed him to provoke an uprising among the Jewish population that would allow the Romans to crush the Jews. The argument is based partly on archaeological evidence from coinage minted in Judea between 29 and 32 AD, which were the first Roman-minted coins in Judea to carry Roman as well as Jewish religious symbols. The portrayal of Pilate as an anti-Semite is also based on evidence from Philo of Alexandria. In his description of a diplomatic visit to Rome in 40 AD to see Emperor Gaius Caligula, Tiberius's successor, entitled On the Embassy of Gaius, Philo referred to Pilate's actions as part of a letter from King Herod Agrippa I, who was then the ruler of the Herodian territories to the north and east of the Roman province. Both Philo's embassy and Agrippa's letter were intended to dissuade Caligula from erecting a large statue of himself at the Temple of Jerusalem, an action which the Jewish people would have considered highly sacrilegious. While Philo may have known about the contents of Agrippa's correspondence with Caligula, the text in the account was written by Philo himself. Philo describes Pilate erecting gilded shields dedicated to Tiberius at Herod's palace in Jerusalem, with the intention of annoying the Jews rather than of honoring Tiberius. After an offending inscription on the shields became public knowledge, 4 Herodian princes approached Pilate and urged him to remove the shields, arguing that the emperor had promised to respect Jewish customs. According to Philo, Pilate recognized that he risked angering the emperor, but refused to back down out of stubbornness. The Jewish officials duly wrote directly to Tiberius, who rebuked Pilate for disrespecting the Jews and ordered him to remove the shields from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Other scholars have challenged the portrayal of Pilate as an anti-Semite. It was rare but not unprecedented for coins in Judea to carry Roman symbols, and Pilate could have used more provocative images on the coins, such as by using an image of the emperor, which would have been deemed idolatrous under Jewish religious law. Moreover, Philo's account was biased because of his theological and political outlook. In his portrayal of Roman emperors and officials, Philo makes clear distinctions between those who respected Jewish law, such as Augustus and Tiberius, and those who persecuted the Jewish people, such as Caligula, Sejanus, and Pilate. According to Jewish theology, in which the Jews are God's chosen, the men who respected Jewish law were hailed as virtuous statesmen, while those who disrespected the Jewish population often suffered for it, since Sejanus and Caligula were both assassinated. In this view, Philo exaggerated Pilate's vices by describing him in the same terms as other individuals deemed hostile to the Jews. Furthermore, Philo's account was motivated by political considerations aiming to assure the new Emperor Claudius of loyalty from the Jewish community, while warning against any attempt by Rome to dishonor Jewish law. Pilate's negative portrayal contrasts with the Herodians. Herod Agrippa had played a major role in the coup that brought Claudius to power and was rewarded by being recognized as king of Judea. Although Agrippa died a few years later in 44 AD, Philo would have been writing while Agrippa was still king and promoted the Herodians as worthy rulers of Judea who could uphold both Jewish and Roman interests. Although Philo's description of Pilate was motivated by theological and political factors, the episode involving the shields would not have been a pure invention. Based on Philo's description of the shields, which contained no figures but inscriptions naming Pilate as the dedicator and Tiberius as the dedicatee, it is believed that the inscription was offensive because it referred to the emperor as the son of the divine Augustus and may also have included his title of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman religion. It was common for Greeks and Romans to erect shields in public spaces to honor certain individuals or gods. They would typically have included portraits, and the fact that Pilate did not decorate the shields with any images of Tiberius suggests that he had no intention of offending the Jews of Jerusalem. Furthermore, the shields were erected in Herod's palace, which served as the Roman governor's residence in Jerusalem and would not have been visible to the wider public. Philo's description of the incident indicates that the local Jewish community were already aware of the presence of the shields and that they only discovered the inscription about the divine Augustus at a later stage, leading to a debate among the Jewish elders. This suggests a scenario in which Pilate and the 4 Herodian princes gathered with other senior members of the Jewish community at a feast. The Jewish elders asked the Herodians to put forward their case, since they were likely to receive a sympathetic hearing from the Roman authorities. Pilate's refusal to move the shields may have been due to fears that their removal would be deemed an insult to the emperor and he could be accused of treason. The safer option was to await instructions from Tiberius by allowing the Jewish leaders to appeal to him. The incident of the shields has traditionally been dated to the second half of Pilate's tenure as governor, perhaps around the time of the fall of Sejanus, who was assassinated on the 18th of October 31 AD after Tiberius was informed of a plot by the Praetorian prefect to make himself emperor. Pilate may have put up the shields in Judea to demonstrate his loyalty to Tiberius during a period of political uncertainty. While Pilate makes only a single appearance in Philo's writings, he is mentioned by Josephus in both the Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish general during the First Jewish Revolt against Rome between 66 and 70 AD. After surrendering to the Roman general Vespasian in 67 AD, Josephus was captured and enslaved, but went on to be a close advisor to both Vespasian and his son Titus. When Vespasian became emperor in 69 AD, he granted Josephus his freedom and bestowed upon him the imperial family name of Flavius. The following year, Josephus served as Titus's aide, while the latter led the siege of Jerusalem that resulted in the destruction of the Second Temple. After accompanying Titus to Rome in 71 AD, he remained in the imperial capital and wrote two major works of history under Flavian patronage. The first was an account of the First Jewish War, written in the mid-70s AD. Beginning the narrative during the Hasmonean period and setting out the context of Roman rule and the rise of Herodians, Josephus describes the war in theological terms by casting the destruction of the temple as divine punishment for the sinfulness and disunity of the Jewish people. He lays particular blame on a small group of Jewish extremists who stirred up trouble against Rome while claiming that the majority of the Jewish population favored Roman rule. While he blames the policies of Roman governors Albinus and Florus for provoking the revolt, Josephus emphasizes the futility of challenging Roman imperial power, an important theme that his imperial patrons would have promoted to deter other nations from rebelling against the empire. In the Jewish War, Josephus gives only a brief overview of the period between the Roman annexation of Judea in 6 AD and the accession of Caligula in 37 AD, suggesting that these 3 decades were generally peaceful and calm. Nevertheless, he mentions 2 incidents involving Pilate that disrupted the relative tranquility in Judea during this otherwise uneventful period. In the first, which bears many similarities with Philo's incident of the shields, Pilate decided to introduce military standards bearing the image of the emperor into Jerusalem under cover of night. When the Jewish people discovered the offending images in their city at daybreak, a large delegation hurried to Caesarea to demand their removal from the holy city. When Pilate refused, they fell to the floor and remained prostrate for 5 days, begging the governor to reconsider. On the 6th day, Pilate called the Jewish crowd to the city amphitheatre and seemed poised to announce his decision from the tribunal. Instead, the governor gave instructions for his troops to surround the Jews, threatening to kill them if they continued to protest. The Jews responded to the threat by falling down to the ground and offering their necks to the soldiers, announcing that they would rather die than violate their sacred law. Pilate was sufficiently moved by this demonstration of faith that he ordered his soldiers to sheath their swords and agreed to remove the standards from Jerusalem. Pilate showed less restraint in his second appearance in the Jewish Wars, in which he used funds from the Corbanus, or temple treasury, for the construction of an aqueduct. An angry Jewish crowd responded by forming a ring around the governor's tribunal in Jerusalem while Pilate was in the city. Pilate had preempted the demonstration and ordered his troops to infiltrate the crowd in civilian dress, arming them with clubs rather than swords. After Pilate gave a prearranged signal, the soldiers began beating the protesters. Many rioters were killed, both from the blows from soldiers and the stampede as the crowd dispersed. Like Philo, Josephus's description of Pilate is shaped by political and theological motives. Josephus was, for example, mainly preoccupied with how the Jewish community responded to disrespectful actions by the Romans. In the first instance, the Jewish people staged a peaceful protest, and their non-confrontational approach eventually persuaded Pilate to back down. On the second occasion, the Jewish crowd, angered by the misappropriation of temple funds, protested violently and suffered terribly at the hands of the Roman troops. Josephus's account of these two incidents reflect his desire to demonstrate that violent resistance against Rome is futile, while a more peaceful approach to make representations to the Roman authorities is more fruitful. Unlike Philo, Josephus describes Pilate's actions without seeking to explain his motivations, but his portrayal nevertheless gives an insight into his character. By installing the standards in Jerusalem surreptitiously in the night time, Pilate knew that he would cause offence and hoped not to attract attention. Pilate's behaviour in response to the ensuing Jewish demonstrations indicates that he hoped to intimidate the people into accepting the standards in order to uphold the dignity of Rome, but backed down at the last minute because he had no desire to kill large numbers of unarmed protesters. In the second episode, Pilate again resorts to deception by concealing his troops among the protesters, though his instruction to arm them only with clubs indicates a desire to avoid bloodshed. Josephus blames the fatal consequences on both the Romans and the aggression of the Jews. While Pilate is shown as being insensitive towards the Jews, the fact that Josephus records only 2 incidents of this nature suggests that Pilate's governorship was otherwise inoffensive. In the Antiquities of the Jews, written 2 decades after the Jewish War, when the Jewish community in Judea suffered from an increasingly repressive Roman regime, Josephus hoped that Rome would return to the earlier policy of respecting Jewish customs and laws by demonstrating that both Romans and Jews who respected Jewish law in Judea would be rewarded, while those who did not would suffer divine punishment. The book gives a more detailed account of Pilate's governorship and explicitly states that he had spent 10 years in Judea and was recalled to Rome at around the time of Tiberius's death. The Antiquities describes the incidents of the military standards and the aqueduct with greater emphasis on Pilate's actions and motivations. Josephus states that Pilate intentionally offended the Jewish people by being the first Roman governor to bring images of the emperor into Jerusalem, while his predecessors had refrained from doing so. Josephus also explains Pilate's refusal to yield to Jewish demands since, quote, "to do so would be an outrage to the emperor." The standoff between Pilate and the Jews ended after the latter displayed their faith in God by signaling their willingness to die. In the protest around the aqueduct, although Josephus mentions the torrent of abuse from some protesters against Pilate, he casts the futile Jewish resistance in a more heroic light and blames the soldiers who inflicted much harder blows than Pilate had ordered, punishing alike both those who were rioting and those who were not. Unlike in the Jewish War, where Josephus holds the Roman governors from the early 60s AD primarily responsible for the outbreak of the Jewish revolt, in the Antiquities, Pilate appears as the first of a series of Roman governors whose abuses against the Jews created resentment towards Rome over a period of many decades, ultimately heading to the uprising in 66 AD. In her attempt to reconstruct the historical event behind Josephus's account of the standards, the historian Helen Bond argues that they were carried by a cohort of the Judean garrison in Caesarea, whom Pilate transferred to Jerusalem not long after taking office. While Pilate was aware of the transgression against Jewish law, he did not appreciate the strength of feeling among the Jewish community in response to the emperor's image being displayed in Jerusalem. The Jews used the offending images as a pretext to protest against the Roman military presence in Jerusalem. While Pilate was reluctant to allow his Jewish subjects to dictate his military dispositions, he eventually agreed to recall the unit to Caesarea after recognizing the strength of Jewish feeling. Pilate could not have financed the aqueduct without authorization from the Jewish religious elders who controlled the temple funds. It is possible that any surplus from the fund could have been used for other city improvements, and the construction of the aqueduct was on the joint initiative of Pilate and the chief priest. While some nationalistic Jews may have objected to any temple funds being used for this purpose, Pilate could have been forced to dip into the main fund reserved for temple sacrifices after the costs of construction were higher than expected. Josephus's description of the protest in Antiquities appears to be a more accurate representation of events. Pilate's decision to order his soldiers to infiltrate the Jewish demonstrators among the crowd would have been dangerous if he expected a violent response from the whole group. The action makes more sense if the demonstration was largely peaceful, but a small group of extremists provoked an excessively violent reaction from the soldiers that Pilate was unable to control. The date of the incident is unknown, but the sequence of events in Josephus's account in the Antiquities indicates that it took place after the incident of the Standards in around 26 AD and before the death of Jesus, which is traditionally dated to 33 AD, but may have happened as early as 30 AD. In Antiquities, Josephus offers a brief description of Pilate's role in the death of Jesus. He refers to Jesus, a wise man, whom Pilate had condemned to be crucified, following accusations from Jewish elders. While this seems like an important near-contemporary reference to Jesus' crucifixion during Pilate's governorship, scholars almost universally agree that this was a later Christian forgery added to Josephus's text, and he did not write it himself. Pilate's part in Jesus' trial and death is mentioned in all 4 canonical Gospels of the New Testament. While Christians believe that the Gospels were divinely inspired, from a historical perspective, the Gospels are historical and literary documents written to promote the Christian faith and assert the divinity of Jesus Christ at a time when the Church was growing but still remained a small religious movement in the Greek-speaking eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. On the whole, the Gospels cast Pilate in a more positive light, portraying him not as a tyrant, but a well-meaning official who is not convinced of Jesus' guilt, yet who ultimately condemns Jesus to death after being too weak to resist pressure from the Jewish community, who regard him as a false prophet and demand Jesus' execution. Nevertheless, there are subtle but important differences in how Pilate is portrayed by each of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the governor may not have been as weak as traditionally believed. Most biblical scholars agree that Mark's Gospel was the earliest of the 4, dating its composition to between 60 and 70 AD. This is consistent with Christian tradition, which holds that Mark was an associate of the apostles Peter and Paul, who wrote the Gospel in Rome shortly after the two apostles were executed during Nero's persecution of the Christians in 64 AD and around the time of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is brought before Pilate by the members of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious court that had already found him guilty and sentenced him to death under Jewish law. While no explanation is given for why Jesus has to stand trial before Pilate, the governor may have had a veto over capital sentences by the Jewish court. As the Roman governor, Pilate was less concerned about whether Jesus was the Messiah than the threat he potentially posed to law and order in Judea. Accordingly, Pilate identifies him as a political threat to the empire by asking him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus evasively replies, "You have said so," refusing to engage with Pilate's attempt to politicize his status, but also refusing to deny the charge. Mark then describes Pilate's astonishment and Jesus' refusal to respond to the accusations leveled at him by the Jewish authorities, which, under Roman law, was deemed an admission of guilt. Mark then mentions a Passover custom in which the governor releases a prisoner. When the crowd asks Pilate to do so, the governor asked them whether they wanted him to release the King of the Jews. Mark suggests that Pilate believed the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him because he represented a threat to their position as leaders of the Jewish community. Pilate himself is conflicted, viewing Jesus too as a potential threat, but also fearing that his execution would provoke a Jewish uprising. Elsewhere in Mark's Gospel, large Jewish crowds were sympathetic to Jesus, but by describing Jesus as King of the Jews, Pilate challenges the crowd to recognize a king that is not the emperor. The Jewish elders realize this and encourage the crowd to demand the release of another prisoner named Barabbas. Pilate then asks what he should do with the one you call the King of the Jews. The crowd responds that he should be crucified, knowing that this was the punishment for treason. When Pilate asks, "Why? What crime has he committed?" he receives the same answer, giving him the political cover to deliver Jesus for crucifixion. Matthew's Gospel is understood to have been written between 80 and 90 AD in Galilee or Syria. The author demonstrates a strong familiarity with Jewish scripture and was writing at a time when his audience of Jewish Christians were splitting away from mainstream Judaism. While Matthew's Gospel takes much of its material from Mark, he also uses a source known as the Q source. After Matthew describes Jesus being brought before Pilate, he breaks off the narrative to focus on Judas, Jesus' betrayer, who acknowledges Jesus' innocence and faces up to the consequence of his actions by returning the 30 pieces of silver he had taken from the Jewish elders and taking his own life. Echoing Mark, Matthew's Pilate asks Jesus if he is the King of the Jews, and Jesus gives the same non-committal answer and remains silent in response to the accusations of the Jewish elders. However, in Matthew's Gospel, Pilate offers the Jewish crowd a choice between releasing Barabbas or Jesus, whom the governor calls the Messiah. Matthew seems less interested in Pilate's motivations than the response of the Jewish crowd, although the title of Messiah would still have had political significance for Pilate. In wanting to be rid of Jesus, Pilate's interests were aligned with the high priest, his political ally. While the governor's question still serves as a test of loyalty among the Jewish people, the identification of Jesus as the Messiah would have been of great contemporary importance for Matthew's audience. At this point in the narrative, Matthew introduces Pilate's unnamed wife, who urges her husband not to have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. This is the only mention of Pilate's wife in all of the sources, and while Pilate was most likely married, her appearance in this scene is almost certainly a literary device. By introducing her, Matthew was suggesting that Pilate's wife was convinced of Jesus' innocence by divine inspiration and was giving her husband an opportunity to spare him, which was rejected in favor of the Jewish crowd's demands. Conversely, the historian Warren Carter argues that Pilate's wife's description of Jesus should be more accurately translated as righteous, and that she was convinced in her dream that Jesus would fulfill God's will by replacing the Roman kingdom with the kingdom of God. According to this interpretation, rather than attempting to spare Jesus, Pilate's wife was actually insisting that he should be executed as soon as possible. In Matthew's Gospel, after the crowd demands Barabbas's release and Jesus' crucifixion, Pilate infamously washes his hands and declares, "I am innocent of this man's blood." As such, Matthew's Pilate is a more passive governor who reluctantly agrees to Jesus' execution and holds the crowd responsible for it. On the other hand, Pilate's washing of his hands could be interpreted as a celebration of his success in making the people responsible for a decision made jointly by the Jewish and Roman elites. Whether Pilate passively acquiesced to Jesus' crucifixion or skillfully manipulated the people into demanding it, his hand-washing does not absolve him from responsibility for Jesus' death. Matthew follows Mark in describing Pilate handing over Jesus' body to Joseph of Arimathea, who placed it into a rock tomb. Pilate makes a final appearance in Matthew's Gospel by instructing the Jewish authorities to seal Jesus' tomb and post a guard to watch over the entrance after concerns arise that Jesus' followers would steal his body and claim that he had risen from the dead. Matthew's Gospel ends with Jesus' resurrection, showing that in spite of Pilate's efforts, he was unable to defeat Jesus. According to both Christian tradition and modern scholarship, Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles were written by the same individual. The prevailing view among scholars is that Luke's Gospel dates from the 80s AD and was written for both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences in Antioch, the capital of the Roman province of Syria. Unlike Matthew, whose Gospel is rooted in Jewish tradition, Luke's account is more interested in imperial history and in Roman rule in Judea, and Pilate is mentioned 3 times before Jesus' trial. In chapter 3, Luke introduces him as the Roman governor of Judea during the reign of Tiberius. Then, in chapter 13, Luke refers to an incident in which Pilate had mixed the blood of Galileans with their sacrifices. In chapter 20, Luke describes an attempt by the Jewish authorities to trap Jesus into challenging Roman authority over tribute payments to Caesar so that they could hand him to the governor. Unlike in Mark and Matthew, where the Jewish trial is the main event, Luke places greater emphasis on the Roman trial. In Luke, the charges of the Jewish authorities are explicitly laid out. "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. In Mark, the idea of Jesus as a king comes from Pilate, but in Luke, the Jewish authorities go to great lengths to present Jesus as a political threat. When Jesus responds, "You have said so," to Pilate's question about him being the king of the Jews, Pilate takes this as a denial and announces to the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." Pilate's abrupt assertion of Jesus' innocence has usually been seen in the context of Luke's political motivations, both to show the Roman authorities that the Christians are harmless and to persuade the Christians that they should not fear Rome. Other historians reject this view and see Luke's Pilate as an arrogant official who dismisses any threat from Jesus and fails to take him seriously. Since Jesus does not look or behave like a king, Pilate believes that a full trial is a waste of his time and instead passes the case to Herod Antipas, the ruler of Jesus' native Galilee, who was in Jerusalem for Passover. In a scene unique to Luke's Gospel, Antipas challenges Jesus to perform some sign to prove his messianic status, but Jesus refuses to respond. Seeing Jesus as a pathetic and harmless figure, Antipas and his soldiers mock him and return him to Pilate after dressing him in an elegant robe, a more traditional outfit for a king. Pilate then announces to the elders and the crowd that neither he nor Antipas found a basis to put Jesus to death, but agrees to flog him as a low-status troublemaker. Pilate's verdict should have been the end of the proceedings, but the crowd appealed to the governor, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" This is the first time Luke mentions Barabbas, and he adds that he had been imprisoned both for taking part in an insurrection and for murder. From Pilate's perspective, Barabbas was a political threat and deserved to be punished. He is presented as being ignorant of the political implications of Jesus' messianic status. As for the Jewish elites, while Barabbas was a criminal who challenged the political order in Jerusalem, Jesus threatens their power as religious leaders. Following a battle of wills between Pilate and the Jewish crowd, in which Pilate makes 3 attempts to release Jesus, he eventually gave in to Jewish demands to release Barabbas while handing Jesus over for crucifixion. As the Roman governor, Pilate had the authority to execute or release both men, but made a decision seemingly diametrically opposed to Roman interests. Some historians view this as an illustration of Pilate's moral cowardice, while others argue that Pilate ultimately determined that it was not worth risking a serious disturbance in Jerusalem to save a lowly Galilean preacher. John's Gospel stands apart from the other 3 Gospels in that it contains a large amount of material that is not found in Matthew, Mark or Luke, which are collectively known as the Synoptic Gospels. Scholars believe that John was the last of the 4 canonical Gospels to be written, dating it to the end of the 1st century AD or beginning of the 2nd century AD. The Gospel is traditionally associated with Ephesus, the capital of the Roman province of Asia in what is now western Turkey. Like Matthew, John appears to have been writing for a Christian audience that had split from the Jewish synagogue and was finding its way in the world in the decades after the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. Whereas Jesus was arrested by the Jewish authorities in the other Gospel accounts, in John's narrative, a cohort of Roman soldiers accompany the Jewish officials who are led to Jesus' hideout at Gethsemane by Judas. They bring him to Annas and Caiaphas for a preliminary interrogation, but they have to obtain Pilate's approval for the death penalty. John's account of the trial before Pilate bears some resemblance to the narratives of Mark as well as Luke, but with important differences. After the Jewish elites presented Jesus to Pilate at his residence, the governor asked them what charges they were bringing against him. When the Jewish authorities responded that they would not have presented him if he were not a criminal, Pilate asked them to judge him under Jewish law, but the Jewish leaders responded that they had no right to execute anybody. Since Roman troops had been involved in Jesus' arrest, Pilate would have known something about the charges against him, but he asserts the authority of Rome and the impotence of the Jews, even in Jerusalem. In contrast to the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is more responsive to Pilate's questioning. Pilate appears to be unsure why the Jewish people want to execute Jesus, and when he asks Jesus if he is a king, the latter speaks of kingship in a spiritual rather than worldly sense. As in Luke, Pilate announces to the crowd that I find no basis for a charge against him. He then introduces the custom of releasing a prisoner during Passover and asks the crowd if they want him to release the King of the Jews. Had Pilate wanted to release Jesus, he could have done so without asking the crowd. But by doing so, he is again casting the responsibility for Jesus' execution onto the Jewish crowd. The crowd clamour for the release of Barabbas. Pilate then orders Jesus to be flogged, while the Roman soldiers mock him by placing a crown of thorns on his head, dressing him in a purple robe, hailing him as King of the Jews. Unlike in Mark and Matthew, the soldiers' mocking of Jesus takes place before Jesus is sentenced to death. With Jesus still in his mock regal attire, Pilate brings him out to the crowd and cries out, "Behold the man," ridiculing any idea of Jesus' royal or messianic pretensions. When Jewish officials respond with a call to crucify him, Pilate tells them, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." Pilate thus reminds the Jewish elites once again that they had no power to do so, while asserting that Jesus posed no threat to Roman authority in Judea. However, the Jewish leaders were adamant and told Pilate that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. This leads Pilate to take the case more seriously, and he returns to ask Jesus where he came from. Jesus refuses to answer any of Pilate's questions until the governor speaks of his power to either release or crucify him, to which Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of greater sin." While John's readers would have understood that Jesus was referring to God, who would use Pilate as the instrument to bring about Jesus' crucifixion and sacrifice for mankind, Pilate takes it to mean the emperor. Jesus' response appears to have encouraged Pilate to make a genuine attempt to release him, but the Jewish crowd warn him that he would be acting in opposition to Caesar if he were to do so. Pilate appears to be convinced by this and prepares to pass his sentence, but before doing so, he mocks both Jesus and the Jewish crowd by declaring, "Here is your king," and asking, "Shall I crucify your king?" As in Mark, Pilate elicits a response from the Jewish priests affirming Roman power. "We have no king but Caesar." After Pilate orders Jesus to be crucified, John describes him preparing a sign written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. While the inscription on the cross is also mentioned in the other Gospels, in John, the Jewish authorities found the inscription offensive and urged Pilate to amend the inscription to say that he claimed to be King of the Jews. Pilate refuses to do so, telling them, "What I have written, I have written," a further demonstration of his dismissive attitude towards the Jewish leaders throughout John's narrative. But the mocking label is closer to the truth than Pilate realizes. Accordingly, while traditional interpretations of Pilate in John's Gospel take his repeated offers to release Jesus at face value and portray him as weak and indecisive, an alternative reading, supported by Helen Bond and Warren Carter, find John's Pilate a powerful figure who demonstrates his authority by mocking both Jesus and his Jewish opponents and secures the loyalty of the Jewish elites. As in the other Gospels, the narrative of Jesus' trial before Pilate contains elements of dramatic irony in which Pilate demonstrates his power as the arbiter of life and death, but unwittingly carries out God's plan by having Jesus crucified. Despite the different portrayals of Pilate across the four Gospels, early Christian theologians believed that Pilate was largely blameless and held the Jewish elites and masses primarily responsible for Jesus' crucifixion. There is a very real possibility that this is all a completely distorted picture of the real Pontius Pilate. A major theory amongst historians contends that Pilate was depicted in the way that he was in the four canonical Gospels in order to absolve the Romans of Jesus' conviction and crucifixion and cast the blame for his death onto the Jewish people. By the time the Gospels were being written between 60 AD and 120 AD, the heads of the Christian Church had moved away from trying to convert the Jewish people and were instead focusing their conversionary activity on Greek and Roman Gentiles. They consequently wanted to present the Romans in a positive light by absolving Pilate as the representative of the Romans of Jesus' murder. Additionally, the authors of the four Gospels were trying to mark the Christian movement as being distinct from Judaism. This was a political move in an era when the Jewish people were viewed with concern by the Roman authorities in the aftermath of the First Jewish Revolt. Hence, it is entirely plausible that the picture presented of Pontius Pilate in the four canonical Gospels is simply early Christian propaganda and may not reflect Pilate's actions and words at all. This tendency to present the Jewish people and not the Romans as being responsible for Jesus' death would inspire centuries of anti-Semitic prejudice on the part of European Christians. One of the leading historians of Jesus' trial and execution, Helen Bond, attempts to reconstruct Jesus' appearance before Pilate as related in the four Gospels in the following fashion. Jesus was arrested by the Jewish leaders with the likely involvement of Roman officials and soldiers. He was first questioned by Caiaphas and his fellow elders amongst the Jewish priests, either informally or formally. The following morning, the Jewish authorities brought Jesus before Pilate, accusing him of falsely claiming to be the Messiah. Pilate was primarily interested in Jesus' claims to kingship and his political threat to Rome, though it is unclear what he thought of Jesus' crime. Either Jesus' refusal to answer the Jewish charges had made him guilty under Roman law, or Pilate considered the case and determined that Jesus was no threat to Rome and deserved a lesser punishment, but chose to crucify Jesus to maintain public order. Historians have been unable to uncover evidence of a Passover tradition involving the release of a prisoner, but on occasion, Roman governors offered amnesties as a gesture of goodwill. It is possible that Jesus and Barabbas's fates became linked in Christian tradition because both men were tried before Pilate on the same day, and Barabbas was either acquitted or found guilty but freed following Pilate's intervention. Scholarly opinion remains divided about whether Jesus' trial and execution took place in 30 AD or 33 AD. The scholars who argue that Pilate was appointed governor by Sejanus to pursue a provocative anti-Jewish policy in Judea prefer the latter date, arguing that after the fall of Sejanus, Pilate was consciously attempting to repair relations with the Jewish elite. However, after taking into account the motivations of their authors, Pilate's actions appear to be more consistent across the Jewish and Christian sources. The Gospels are primarily interested in Pilate's role in Jesus' crucifixion and, with the exception of Luke, do not mention him in any other context. Evidence for Pilate's later life and career comes from a final appearance in Josephus' Antiquities, in the context of a presumed uprising by the Samaritans, a people who shared ethnic and religious traditions with the Jews, but who were considered bitter rivals owing to their religious differences. Josephus mentions an unnamed individual who promised to uncover the Ark of the Covenant deposited by Moses at Mount Gerizim, the holiest site in the Samaritan religion. A large group of Samaritans gathered at the village of Tirathana at the foot of the mountain and prepared to follow this messianic figure up the mountain. Such a large gathering threatened disorder, and Pilate responded by sending a military force to block the path up the mountain. During an initial engagement, the Roman troops killed some of the Samaritans and put the others to flight. Pilate then proceeded to execute the leaders of the group. Josephus describes the Council of Samaritans appealing to Lucius Vitellius, the legate of Syria, claiming that they were refugees from Pilate's tyranny rather than rebels. Vitellius sent Pilate to Rome to answer the charges against him before the emperor, but by the time he arrived, Tiberius was already dead. While Josephus provides no further details about the rest of Pilate's life, he never returned to Jerusalem, suggesting that the charges against him had been upheld. Helen Bond argues that Pilate's intervention was justified, since the Samaritans may have been armed as a precaution, and he was within his rights as governor to mobilize his troops against such a demonstration. Vitellius is unlikely to have accepted the Samaritans' complaints against a fellow Roman official without consulting Pilate, and his decision to send Pilate to Rome does not necessarily indicate that he believed Pilate was guilty, but that only the emperor could rule on such a case. Had Tiberius still been alive, he might have sent Pilate back to Judea to resume his duties. Pontius Pilate is one of the most famous and controversial characters from the Bible. As an historical figure, he is only associated with a handful of events during his 10 years as prefect of governor of Judea. While the dates are unclear, Josephus' Antiquities offers the best sense of the chronology. Not long after his appointment as governor in 26 AD, Pilate attempted to deploy a unit of troops carrying standards bearing Caesar's image into Jerusalem. After the Jewish community protested for several days, Pilate agreed to send the troops and their standards back to Caesarea. A few years later, Pilate offended his Jewish subjects again by using temple funds to finance the construction of an aqueduct bringing water to Jerusalem. When the Jews launched their protest, Pilate hoped to control the crowd by posting soldiers in disguise among the demonstrators. Some of the soldiers were provoked by extremists in the crowd and began beating the protesters, some of whom were killed in the process. Around 5 years into Pilate's tenure, after the fall of his patron, Sejanus, in Rome, Pilate attempted to demonstrate his loyalty to Tiberius by introducing shields honoring the emperor in Jerusalem. The inscriptions describing the emperor as the son of the divine Augustus offended the Jewish people, who demanded their removal on religious grounds. Pilate was reluctant to do so without the emperor's approval and allowed the Herodian princes to write to Tiberius on the issue. The emperor ordered Pilate to remove the shields to Caesarea. A year or two before or after this incident, Pilate presided over the trial that condemned Jesus to die on the cross after the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem identified Jesus as a threat to public order. Pilate remained in Judea until late 36 AD, when he was recalled to Rome after being accused of a heavy-handed response to a Samaritan gathering. Much of what we allegedly know about Pilate might be highly coloured by the way in which the writers of the Gospels wanted to attribute the blame for Jesus' death on the Jewish people rather than the Romans, with Pilate standing as their representative. Almost everything else about the life and career of this infamous individual will forever remain a mystery. What do you think of Pontius Pilate? Was he a tyrant who persecuted the Jewish community, or was he a skillful politician who executed his duties efficiently and successfully maintained law and order in Judea? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.